Maya, when you first saw that cabin buried in the Olympic Peninsula rainforest, what went through your mind?
Honestly, Tony, I thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Here I was, fresh from a divorce that destroyed everything I thought I knew about myself, staring at this 1890s ruin that looked like something from a horror movie. Moss hanging like funeral shrouds, fog so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. My inheritance felt more like a curse. But when I stepped inside and started recording for the podcast, something shifted. The place felt alive somehow, like it was waiting for me specifically.
That's fascinating, because what happened next challenges everything we think we know about reality itself.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
So Maya, you mentioned that the cabin felt alive, waiting for you. Can you describe what those first few days were like as you started documenting the restoration?
The isolation was overwhelming at first, Tony. I'd drive 3 hours from Seattle on these winding logging roads, and the last mile was just a dirt track barely wide enough for my truck. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, and cell service was non-existent. I'd set up my recording equipment in what used to be the main room, and the silence was so complete, it felt like being inside a tomb.
But you kept going back.
I had nowhere else to go, really. The divorce settlement left me with enough money to survive for maybe 6 months if I was careful, and this cabin was the only asset I had left. Plus, I'd already committed to the podcast series about the restoration. My listeners were expecting weekly updates about transforming this ruin into something livable. I couldn't disappoint them.
Tell me about the structure itself. What were you working with?
Pause. It was a classic Pacific Northwest homesteader cabin, built sometime in the 1890s from old-growth cedar. The foundation was these massive river stones, still solid after more than a century. But everything else was falling apart. The roof had holes you could see sky through, floorboards were rotting, and the whole place was covered in this thick velvet moss that seemed to grow faster than I could scrape it off. The windows were mostly broken, and Douglas fir saplings were actually growing through the gaps in the walls.
It sounds like it would take years to make habitable.
That's what I thought initially. But as an architect, I could see the bones were good. The frame was still square, the foundation hadn't shifted. It was like someone had built it to last forever, then just walked away one day and let the forest reclaim it. There was something almost intentional about the decay, if that makes sense.
You've mentioned before that you felt drawn to document everything. Was that purely for the podcast?
Partly, but it became an obsession pretty quickly. I'd photograph every board before I removed it, every layer of wallpaper I peeled away. I found myself talking to my recording equipment constantly, narrating every small discovery. A rusted nail that told me about construction techniques, a piece of newspaper from 1923 stuffed in a wall crack for insulation. Each artifact felt like a breadcrumb leading somewhere important.
And you were completely alone during all this work?
Completely. I'd bought camping gear and was sleeping in my truck at first, because the cabin wasn't weatherproof. The Olympic Peninsula has this reputation for rain. But it's more than that, Tony. It's this constant mist that seems to rise from the ground itself. Everything stays damp. Your clothes, your tools, even your thoughts feel soggy and heavy. The ferns are taller than you are, and the old-growth trees are so massive they block out most daylight even at noon.
You described it once as feeling like the forest was watching you.
Longer pause, it sounds dramatic, but yes, there's something about that particular ecosystem. The silence is so profound that any sound becomes magnified. A branch falling a quarter-mile away sounds like it's right behind you, and the fog plays tricks. You'll see shapes moving in your peripheral vision, but when you turn to look, it's just mist swirling around a stump or a boulder.
When did you first notice something unusual about your recordings?
It was probably the 3rd week. I was reviewing audio from the day before, checking for good segments to edit for the podcast. I do all my editing with headphones to catch every detail, every ambient sound that might add atmosphere for listeners. That's when I heard it.
What exactly did you hear?
A voice in the background. Very faint, almost like whispers under the sound of my power saw. At first I thought it was interference, maybe picking up radio signals or something. But when I isolated the frequency and amplified it, it was clearly human speech. A woman's voice, talking about kitchen renovations.
Kitchen renovations?
That's what made it so unsettling. She was discussing cabinet placement and whether to move a window to get better morning light. Exactly the kind of decisions I was struggling with. But Tony, I'd been alone that entire day. The nearest house was miles away, and I hadn't heard anyone while I was actually working.
How did you explain it to yourself?
I'm an architect, a practical person. I convinced myself it had to be some kind of audio bleed-through. Old radio broadcasts, maybe electronic interference from my equipment. I even researched whether certain atmospheric conditions could carry voices across long distances. I needed a logical explanation, because the alternative was unthinkable.
But it happened again.
The next recording session, I heard multiple voices. This time it was clearer. A man and woman discussing whether to add a second story to accommodate children they were planning to have. They talked about lumber costs and finding skilled carpenters. Their voices had this quality like they were in the same room with me, but when I looked around, I was still completely alone.
How did that affect your work?
I became obsessive about the recordings. I'd set up multiple microphones throughout the cabin, trying to pinpoint where the voices were strongest. I started staying later into the evening, hoping to capture more. The restoration work almost became secondary to this mystery I was trying to solve. I'd review hours of audio, mapping every whisper and fragment of conversation.
Were you sleeping well during this period?
Laughs softly sleep became complicated. I'd upgraded from the truck to a small tent inside the cabin once I got part of the roof patched, but the voices seemed strongest at night. I'd lie there in my sleeping bag, listening to what sounded like family conversations happening in rooms that were mostly empty space and rotting beams. Sometimes I'd hear children laughing upstairs, but there was no upstairs anymore, just open sky and tree branches.
Did you consider leaving?
Every day. But where would I go? My marriage was over, my old life in Seattle felt like it belonged to someone else, and this cabin was literally all I had left. Plus, the voices weren't threatening. They were talking about everyday things, planning meals, discussing repairs, sharing small domestic moments that felt almost comforting after the isolation I'd been living with.
You mentioned that the conversations became more detailed over time.
That's when things got really unsettling. The voices started discussing specific problems I was facing with the restoration. How to sister a cracked beam, whether the chimney foundation could support a new fireplace insert, technical details that showed real knowledge about the cabin's structure and history. It was like having invisible consultants who knew the building better than I did.
Did you ever try to interact with them?
Pause. You mean, did I try talking back? Not initially. I was still clinging to rational explanations. But there were moments when I'd be struggling with a particular problem, muttering to myself about solutions, and I'd hear advice in the background of my recordings. Practical, helpful suggestions that actually worked when I tried them.
That must have been incredibly disorienting.
It challenged everything I thought I understood about reality, Tony. I'm someone who builds things, who solves problems with calculations and blueprints. But here I was apparently receiving guidance from voices that shouldn't exist, working on a restoration that seemed to know what it wanted to become. The line between helping the cabin and the cabin helping me started to blur.
Were there any other physical evidence of previous occupants?
That's what made the voices so puzzling. The cabin had clearly been abandoned for decades. No recent footprints, no signs of squatters or maintenance. But as I stripped away layers of decay, I kept finding small personal items. A child's marble wedged between floorboards, reading glasses wrapped in cloth and tucked behind a loose stone in the fireplace. Little treasures hidden like someone expected to come back for them someday.
Did you research the history of the property?
I tried, but records for that area are sparse. The county had basic information about when it was built and a few ownership transfers, but nothing about the families who actually lived there. No census records, no local newspaper mentions. It was like the people who made this place home had been erased from official history, but their presence was still soaked into the wood and stone.
How long did you work before discovering anything more substantial?
About 6 weeks of steady restoration work. I was making real progress by then. New roof sections, reinforced flooring, basic electrical rough-in. The cabin was starting to feel less like a ruin and more like a home someone could actually inhabit. That's when I found the hidden room.
Tell our listeners about that discovery.
I was working on the north wall, replacing some damaged boards, when my measuring tape showed an inconsistency. The interior wall was 3 feet shorter than the exterior wall should allow. So either the original builders made a major error, which seemed unlikely given the quality of their other work, or there was space behind that wall that I couldn't account for.
What did you do?
I started carefully removing boards, expecting to find maybe a storage alcove or evidence of a structural modification. Instead, I found a door. A proper door with hinges and a handle, just covered over with newer planking. Someone had deliberately concealed an entire room.
Were you nervous about opening it?
Terrified, honestly, but also desperate to understand what was happening to me. The voices had been getting stronger, more frequent. Sometimes I'd hear entire conversations during my recordings, families discussing their daily lives in such detail that I felt like I was eavesdropping on real people. Finding this hidden room felt like it might finally provide some answers.
And what you found inside changed everything.
Long pause, Tony. What I found in that room challenged not just my understanding of the cabin, but my understanding of myself, of memory, identity, and whether our lives are as linear and unique as we want to believe.
We're going to pause there, Maya, because what comes next deserves its own space to breathe. Tomorrow, we'll explore what was waiting behind that hidden door and how it forced you to question the very nature of who you are.
For listeners who want to share their own experiences with places that seem to hold memories, you can reach us through the show notes. And if this story is resonating with you, please share it. Sometimes the most important conversations happen when we're brave enough to question what we think we know about reality.
Welcome back, Maya. Yesterday we left off with you discovering that hidden room behind the north wall. I have to say, our listeners have been reaching out all night wanting to know what you found in there.
I've been thinking about how to describe it, Tony. Even now, months later, I'm not sure I have adequate words for what I experienced when I finally opened that door.
Take your time. What was your first impression when you stepped inside?
The air was different. Dry, which was impossible given the Pacific Northwest climate. Everything else in the cabin was perpetually damp from the coastal fog. But this room felt preserved somehow, like it existed in its own microclimate. And the smell, Tony. It wasn't musty or abandoned. It smelled like lemon oil and old paper, as if someone had been maintaining it regularly.
How large was the space?
Maybe 8 by 10 feet, with a slanted ceiling that followed the roofline. But it was what filled the space that stopped me cold. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls, and every shelf was packed with books and journals. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all bound in similar leather covers, organized by what looked like date ranges marked on the spines.
Were they in good condition?
Pristine. That's what was so unsettling. These journals looked like they'd been written yesterday, not decades ago. The leather was supple, the pages crisp white. I picked up the nearest one and opened it to a random page, expecting to find some previous owner's family history, or maybe property records.
But that's not what you found.
Long pause. The handwriting was mine, Tony. Not similar to mine, not someone with comparable penmanship. It was my exact handwriting, down to the way I cross my T's and the little loop I make at the bottom of my Y's. I've been writing architectural notes for 15 years. I know my own hand like I know my own voice.
What was the content of the writing?
It was a restoration diary, day-by-day documentation of repairing this exact cabin. The author described removing the same rotted floorboards I'd replaced, patching the same roof sections I'd worked on. Even the weather matched my memories. She wrote about a particularly stubborn morning fog that lasted until noon, on what I realized was the same day I'd noted the same fog in my own project journal.
When you say she, you're referring to yourself?
That's the thing, Tony. It was my handwriting, my specific observations about the cabin's construction details, but the entries were describing experiences I'd never had. The author talked about sleeping in a green canvas tent inside the main room while doing the restoration work. I'd used a blue nylon tent. She mentioned listening to a particular folk music album while working. I don't even like folk music.
How many journals were there?
I stopped counting after 30. They seemed to span decades, maybe longer. The dates were confusing because some used different calendar systems, but the earliest ones I could, appeared to be from the 1920s. All in my handwriting, all describing restoration work on this same cabin, but with different details, different choices, different outcomes.
Different outcomes?
Some versions describe successfully completing the restoration and living here happily for years. Others documented abandoning the project partway through, usually after experiencing the same voices I'd been hearing. A few described darker endings. One journal's final entry just said, "I can't tell what's real anymore," written over and over for 3 pages.
How did you react to finding these?
I sat on the floor of that hidden room and read for hours, Tony. I was looking for some rational explanation. Maybe the previous owner had been forging my handwriting, though that seemed impossible since I'd inherited the cabin from a great-aunt I'd never met. Or maybe I was having some kind of psychotic break and creating false memories about writing in journals I didn't remember touching.
Did you find any other evidence in the room?
There was a small wooden desk in the corner with a fountain pen lying open next to an unfinished journal entry. The ink was still wet, fresh enough that when I accidentally brushed it with my finger, it smeared. Someone had been writing in there recently, but the cabin had been sealed up when I inherited it. I was supposedly the first person inside in decades.
What did that unfinished entry say?
Pause. It described hearing my voice coming from the main room. The author had written, "She's back again, talking to her recording equipment about the kitchen renovation plans. Same voice, same concerns about the window placement. I wonder if she'll find this room faster this time, or if she'll take the full 6 weeks like the others."
The others?
That's when I started looking more carefully at the journals, trying to find patterns. Each restoration attempt followed a similar timeline. 6 weeks of work, discovering the voices, finding the hidden room, and then either completing the project or abandoning it. But Tony, the details varied in ways that suggested these weren't the same person having the same experience repeatedly.
What kind of variations?
Different life stories leading to the inheritance. Some authors mentioned divorces, others talked about job losses or family deaths that brought them to the cabin. A few described being drawn here by dreams or intuitions they couldn't explain. But they all had my handwriting, and they all approached the restoration work with the same architectural knowledge I have.
Did you recognize any of the specific experiences they described?
That's what made it so terrifying. I'd read about someone struggling with a particular roof beam that was warped in exactly the same way I dealt with a warped beam. But their solution was different from mine, and when I went to check my actual repair work, I found evidence that both approaches had been tried. Nail holes that didn't match my current repairs, tool marks that suggested different techniques.
As if multiple people had worked on the same problems at different times.
Or the same person had worked on them multiple times with different approaches. Tony, I found a journal entry that described the exact conversation we had in yesterday's episode. Word for word. The author had written about discovering the hidden room and how tomorrow I'll explain to Tony about the journals, and how they made me question everything I thought I knew about identity and memory.
The author mentioned me by name?
And accurately predicted how this conversation would unfold. She wrote, "Tony will ask about the variations in experiences, and I'll tell him about the different solutions to the roof beam problem. He'll want to know if I recognized specific experiences, and I'll explain about finding evidence of multiple repair attempts."
How could that be possible?
I've been asking myself that question for months, Tony. Either I'm experiencing some kind of elaborate delusion, where I'm creating false memories about reading predictions of conversations that haven't happened yet, or something much stranger is going on, something that challenges our basic assumptions about how time and identity work.
Did you find any explanation within the journals themselves?
A few of the authors tried to develop theories. One suggested that certain places can become unstuck from linear time, especially locations where intense emotions have been repeatedly experienced. Another believed that traumatic life changes can create fractures in our sense of self, allowing us to slip between different versions of our own existence.
What was your emotional state while reading all of this?
Terrified, but also strangely comforted. For weeks, I'd been questioning my sanity because of the voices. Finding evidence that others had experienced the same thing, even if those others might somehow be me, made me feel less alone, less crazy. But it also raised bigger questions about what was happening to me and whether I could trust my own memories and perceptions.
Did you notice any changes in the voices after discovering the journals?
They became clearer, more specific. Instead of general conversations about restoration work, I started hearing what sounded like different versions of myself discussing the journals. Debates about which theories made the most sense, arguments about whether to continue the restoration or abandon it like some of the previous attempts.
You were hearing conversations between different versions of yourself?
That's how it felt. And Tony, the most unsettling part was that I began to recognize some of the voices, not as strangers but as aspects of my own personality. The practical architect voice that wanted logical explanations, the intuitive voice that was drawn to supernatural possibilities, the frightened voice that just wanted to escape back to Seattle and pretend none of this was happening.
Tomorrow we're going to explore how these discoveries affected your restoration work and your sense of reality. But I have to ask, Maya, as you're telling me this story, do you feel confident that this conversation is happening for the first time?
Very long pause, Tony. That's the question that keeps me awake at night.
That pause tells me everything, Maya. You're not certain this is our first conversation about these events.
When I read that journal entry predicting our discussion word for word, it planted a seed of doubt that's been growing ever since. Sometimes when you ask a question, I have the strangest feeling that I've answered it before. Not déjà vu exactly, but something deeper. Like muscle memory of conversations.
Our listeners deserve to know what they're hearing. Are you saying you might have lived through this interview previously?
I'm saying I can't trust my own perception of what's happening anymore, Tony. After finding those journals, the line between memory and experience became completely blurred. I'd wake up some mornings with clear recollections of working on parts of the cabin that I hadn't touched yet. Or I'd reach for a tool and my hand would go directly to a location where I didn't remember placing it.
How did this affect your day-to-day restoration work?
It became surreal. I'd start a project, like installing new window frames, and halfway through I'd realize I was following a technique I'd never learned. My hands seemed to know exactly how the original builders had fitted the joints, where they'd cut corners which boards would be rotten before I even removed the old trim to check.
Were you still documenting everything for your podcast?
Obsessively. But Tony, when I'd listen back to my recordings at night, I started hearing things I didn't remember saying. Commentary about the work that sounded like my voice, but discussing choices I hadn't made yet. I'd recorded myself talking about finishing the kitchen renovation on a day when I was still working on the foundation repairs.
That must have been incredibly disorienting.
I started questioning whether I was losing time somehow. I'd set up my equipment to record a session about morning roof work, and when I played it back, I'd hear myself describing evening conversations with contractors I'd never hired, detailed discussions about material costs and timeline adjustments that made perfect sense for the project, but referenced meetings that never happened.
Did you try to verify these discrepancies?
How do you verify your own memories, Tony? I called the lumber yard mentioned in one of my phantom recordings, and they had detailed notes about orders I supposedly placed, orders I had no recollection of making, but the materials had been delivered and were sitting in my work area. Quality wood that perfectly matched the cabin's original construction.
Someone else could have placed those orders.
Using my name, my credit card, and specifications that exactly matched my restoration plans. The delivery driver even commented on how I'd changed my hair since our last conversation. I'd never met him before in my life, but he described our previous interaction with enough detail that I started wondering if I was having blackouts.
What did the voices in your recordings sound like during this period?
They were becoming more collaborative, if that makes sense. Instead of distant family conversations, I was hearing what sounded like planning sessions. Multiple voices, including ones I recognized as variations of my own, discussing the best approach to different restoration challenges. Like having a whole team of consultants who understood the cabin's history intimately.
Were they helpful consultations?
Incredibly helpful, which made the whole situation even more unsettling. I'd be struggling with a structural problem, and I'd hear detailed discussions about solutions that actually worked. The voices would debate different approaches, share experiences from previous attempts, and ultimately recommend techniques that saved me weeks of trial and error.
Previous attempts?
That phrase kept coming up in the background conversations. References to last time we tried that approach, or remember when the foundation work failed in the winter attempt, as if this restoration had been tried multiple times before, with different outcomes, and all those experiences were somehow available as reference material.
How did you rationalize these experiences?
I stopped trying to rationalize them, Tony. When rationality fails consistently enough, you have to consider that your understanding of what's possible might be incomplete. I started treating the voices as a resource, rather than a symptom. If my subconscious, or whatever was happening to me, had access to useful information about the cabin's restoration, maybe I should listen instead of fighting it.
That's a significant shift in perspective.
It was survival, really. I was alone in the woods with a massive project, limited resources, and apparently unreliable memories of my own progress. The voices and the information they provided were helping me accomplish something beautiful. The cabin was transforming from a ruin into something that felt truly alive again.
Describe what the cabin was like during this phase of the work.
It was developing a personality, Tony. Sounds strange to say about a building, but as I restored each room, the space began to feel inhabited again. Not by ghosts exactly, but by the accumulated love and care of all the families who'd made it home. The kitchen started smelling like bread and coffee when I worked in there. The main room would be warm even on cold mornings, as if the fireplace had been burning all night.
Were these changes noticeable in your audio recordings?
My equipment started picking up ambient sounds that shouldn't have existed. Footsteps on the restored floors when I was working outside, water running through pipes that weren't connected yet, children's laughter from the loft space that was still just exposed beams and sky.
Did this feel threatening?
The opposite, actually. It felt welcoming, like the cabin was happy to have someone caring for it again, bringing it back to life. I started looking forward to the evening conversations I'd hear in my recordings. They became companions in a way, familiar voices discussing familiar concerns about our shared home.
Our shared home.
That's how it began to feel, Tony. Not my restoration project, but a collaborative effort between me and all previous versions who'd worked on this same dream. We were all trying to save something beautiful, to create a sanctuary from whatever had driven us to seek shelter in this hidden place.
Tomorrow, we'll explore how this collaborative relationship evolved and what happened when you realized the restoration was nearing completion. But Maya, I need to ask you something that might sound strange. Do you remember what question I'm going to ask you next?
Long pause. You're going to ask me whether I think the cabin wanted to be restored, or whether it was the restoration work that was trapping people in these repeated cycles.
That's exactly what I was going to ask.
Tony, I think that's the question that determines whether someone finds peace in this place or becomes another journal entry in that hidden room.
That's a profound observation, Maya. The idea that a question itself could determine someone's fate. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
I realize that how you frame the experience changes everything, Tony. If you believe the cabin is some kind of supernatural prison, trapping souls in endless restoration cycles, then you approach every strange occurrence as evidence of being trapped. But if you see it as a place that calls to people who need healing, who need to create something beautiful from ruins, then the same experiences become collaborative, rather than imprisoning.
When did this realization occur to you?
About a week after finding the journals. I was reading through entries from what appeared to be the 1940s, written by someone who sounded increasingly paranoid and desperate. She described feeling watched, manipulated, forced to continue work she wanted to abandon. But Tony, her handwriting was becoming more erratic with each entry. Her descriptions of the cabin's needs were growing obsessive, almost violent.
Violent how?
She wrote about the cabin demanding certain repairs, punishing her when she tried to take breaks. She described the voices as accusatory, critical, never satisfied with her efforts. The final entries talked about the cabin consuming her time, her energy, her sense of self. It was the same supernatural situation I was experiencing, but interpreted through a lens of fear and resistance.
Whereas your interpretation had been more collaborative.
Exactly. I'd been treating the voices as helpful consultants, the strange timing issues as access to useful information from previous attempts. This other version of me, or whoever she was, had experienced the same phenomena as an attack on her autonomy. And Tony, her restoration work reflected that mindset. She'd forced solutions that damaged the cabin's original character, fought against the building's natural tendencies, instead of working with them.
Did you find evidence of this damage in your own restoration work?
Absolutely. Areas where repairs had been done with anger rather than care. Joints forced together with excessive hardware instead of being properly fitted. Sections where original materials had been replaced with inappropriate modern alternatives, as if the person doing the work was trying to impose her will on the building rather than restore its authentic character.
How did this discovery change your approach?
It made me realize that my relationship with the cabin was a choice, not something being imposed on me. The voices, the time slips, the repeated cycles mentioned in the journals, they weren't supernatural imprisonment. They were opportunities, chances to get the restoration right, to approach it with the right mindset, to create something that honored both the buildings, history, and the needs of whoever was seeking refuge there.
But Maya, that raises an unsettling question. If each person has a choice about how to interpret these experiences, what happens to those who choose the fearful interpretation?
Long pause. I found partial answer to that in the most recent journal entries, the ones with wet ink that suggested someone had been writing just before I arrived. The handwriting was mine, but the content was terrifying, Tony. Page after page of the same phrases repeated. I can't leave. I can't finish. I can't remember who I was before this place.
It sounds like someone who'd become trapped in indecision.
Trapped between interpretations. She couldn't embrace the collaborative approach because she was too frightened of losing herself completely, but she couldn't fully reject the experience either because the cabin's pull was too strong, the restoration work too compelling. So she was stuck in a loop of starting and stopping, advancing and retreating, never finding peace in either direction.
How did reading these entries affect you emotionally?
It felt like looking into a possible future, Tony. A warning about what could happen if I let fear take over. If I started questioning every moment of joy I found in the work, every sense of belonging I felt in the restored spaces. I realized I was at a crucial decision point.
What kind of decision?
Whether to trust the experience or fight it. Whether to complete the restoration with gratitude and openness, or to become another journal writer documenting her confusion and fear until the cycle started over with someone new. The choice felt enormous, like it would determine not just the success of my project, but something fundamental about who I would become.
Did you notice any changes in your surroundings as you wrestled with this decision?
The cabin itself seemed to be holding its breath, Tony. The warm, welcoming atmosphere I'd been enjoying became neutral, waiting. The voices in my recordings grew quieter, less frequent. Even my tools seemed less cooperative, as if everything was waiting to see which path I would choose before responding accordingly.
What finally helped you make the decision?
I remembered why I'd come to the cabin in the first place. I was fleeing a marriage where I'd lost myself, a career where I'd stopped creating and started just managing other people's uninspired projects. The cabin was giving me a chance to build something beautiful with my own hands, to connect with a place and a purpose that felt meaningful. Why would I choose fear over that opportunity?
So, you decided to embrace the collaborative interpretation fully?
I did more than embrace it, Tony. I started talking back to the voices during my work sessions. Instead of just listening to their conversations, I began asking questions about the restoration choices, requesting advice about specific challenges, expressing gratitude for the guidance I was receiving. It transformed the experience from something happening to me into something I was actively participating in.
How did the voices respond to your direct engagement?
They became more present, more immediate. Instead of overhearing distant conversations, I was having real-time consultations with what felt like a whole team of restoration experts who understood the cabin intimately. They'd warn me about weak floorboards before I stepped on them, suggest better approaches to complex repairs, even share stories about the families who'd lived in each room.
Stories about the families?
Beautiful stories, Tony. I learned about children who'd carved their initials in the closet doorframe, about a woman who'd grown herbs on the windowsills, about celebrations and quiet moments, and everyday love that had filled these spaces. The voices weren't just helping me restore the building's structure. They were helping me understand its soul.
Did this deeper connection change the physical restoration work itself?
Everything became easier and more intuitive. I'd reach for exactly the right tool without thinking. My measurements were consistently accurate. Even complex repairs that should have required multiple attempts went smoothly on the first try. It was as if I was accessing not just advice, but actual skill and experience from all the previous restoration attempts.
That must have been incredibly satisfying as an architect.
It was transcendent, Tony. I was finally creating something that perfectly balanced my professional knowledge with deeper wisdom about what this particular place needed. Every choice felt both technically sound and emotionally right. The cabin was becoming everything I dreamed when I first inherited it, but better than I could have achieved alone.
Tomorrow we'll explore what happened as you approached completion of this transcendent restoration project. But Maya, I need to ask you directly, do you believe you are still the same person who'd arrived at the cabin months earlier?
That's the most important question in this entire story, Tony. Because if the answer is no, then everything that follows makes perfect sense.
Maya, that statement suggests a fundamental transformation occurred during the restoration process. Can you help our listeners understand what you mean when you say you weren't the same person anymore?
I mean exactly that, Tony. The woman who'd fled Seattle after her divorce was an architect who'd lost her creative soul, someone who'd spent years compromising her vision to meet other people's expectations. But the person working on that cabin had access to skills, intuition, and confidence I'd never possessed before. I wasn't just learning new techniques. I was remembering abilities that felt ancient.
Remembering abilities you'd never learned.
That's where things became impossible to rationalize, Tony. I'd wake up knowing how to repair a specific type of 1,890 seconds window hardware that I'd never encountered in my professional training. My hands would move through complex joinery techniques that should have taken years to master. When I researched these methods later, they were historically accurate approaches that had been used by craftsmen from that exact era.
How did you explain this to yourself at the time?
I stopped trying to explain it and started documenting it instead. Every morning, I'd record what I'd learned overnight, what new skills seemed available to me, what restoration approaches felt suddenly familiar. The recordings became a catalog of impossible knowledge that was nonetheless perfectly practical for the work I was doing.
Were you concerned about your mental state during this period?
Strangely, no. Despite everything that should have been alarming about the situation, I felt more mentally clear and emotionally stable than I had in years, Tony. The anxiety and depression that had plagued me since my divorce were completely gone. I was sleeping deeply, eating well, and approaching each day's work with enthusiasm I hadn't felt since architecture school.
But surely the impossibility of what was happening must have created some anxiety?
It should have. But Tony, when impossible things are also beneficial things, you start questioning whether your definition of possible might be too narrow. The cabin was being beautifully restored. I was developing skills that any craftsperson would envy. I felt connected to meaningful work and to the place I was creating. Why would I choose anxiety over gratitude?
That's a remarkably pragmatic approach to supernatural experiences.
Or maybe it was the first truly practical approach I'd ever taken to anything in my life. Instead of fighting against circumstances I couldn't control, I was working with them to create something extraordinary. The results spoke for themselves. By late autumn, the cabin was becoming something that exceeded my wildest architectural fantasies.
Describe what the cabin looked like at this stage of completion.
It was alive, Tony. Every room had its own character, but they all flowed together into a cohesive whole that felt both historically authentic and perfectly suited to modern living. The kitchen had hand-fitted cabinets that showcased the wood's natural grain. The main room featured a restored fireplace that drew perfectly and filled the space with warm light. Even the smallest details, like the way light moved through the restored windows, created an atmosphere of peaceful contentment.
Were you still hearing voices during this period?
The voices had evolved into something more like inner dialogue, Tony. Instead of overhearing conversations, I was thinking thoughts that felt collaborative. When I considered different approaches to a project, I'd hear multiple perspectives in my own mind, as if I was consulting with a team of experts who all happened to share my voice, but brought different experiences to each decision.
That sounds like it could have been disorienting.
It was the opposite of disorienting. It was like finally thinking with my full capacity instead of the limited perspective I'd been stuck with my entire life. Every choice was informed by multiple lifetimes of relevant experience. I could anticipate problems before they occurred, choose materials that would age gracefully, design solutions that honored both form and function perfectly.
Maya, I need to ask about something that might be difficult. Were you in contact with anyone from your previous life during this time?
Pause. That's when everything changed, Tony. In early November, my phone started getting reception again. The first call I received was from my divorce attorney, asking why I'd missed 3 court appointments I had no memory of scheduling. According to her records, I'd been calling regularly to postpone meetings and extend deadlines. But Tony, I had no recollection of making any of those calls.
How did you respond to that information?
I checked my phone records, and there they were. Dozens of outgoing calls to lawyers, contractors in Seattle, even my former husband. Conversations that had apparently lasted for hours, discussing details about property division and project timelines I couldn't remember. It was like discovering that part of me had been living a completely separate life while I was focused on the restoration.
What did this discovery make you realize?
That I wasn't just gaining abilities and memories, Tony. I was losing time, possibly losing myself, the person who'd been making those phone calls, handling my legal obligations, maintaining my connections to the outside world. That wasn't the same person who was joyfully restoring the cabin each day. We were somehow existing simultaneously, and I was only conscious of one perspective at a time.
That must have been incredibly disorienting, Maya. How did you reconcile these 2 versions of yourself coexisting?
I couldn't reconcile them, Tony. That was the problem. I'd sit down to call my attorney back, and suddenly it would be 3 hours later with no memory of the conversation, but notes in my handwriting about legal strategies I didn't understand. Meanwhile, my restoration work continued seamlessly, as if that part of me was completely unaffected by these external obligations.
Were you able to determine which version felt more authentic to who you really were?
Long pause. That's where things became truly frightening, Tony. Both versions felt completely real when I was experiencing them. When I was working on the cabin, the legal calls seemed like distant obligations from someone else's life. But when I found myself handling business matters, the restoration work felt like elaborate daydreams I'd been indulging in instead of dealing with reality.
Did this dual existence affect the quality of either experience?
It made everything feel unstable. The peaceful confidence I'd found in my restoration work started eroding because I couldn't trust my own continuity of experience. How could I make long-term decisions about the cabin when I might lose hours or days to this other version of myself who had completely different priorities?
How did you attempt to regain control of the situation?
I started leaving myself detailed notes, Tony. Every morning I'd write down what I planned to accomplish that day, and every evening I'd document what actually happened. But even that system broke down because sometimes I'd find notes written in my handwriting that described events I had no memory of, conversations with people I'd never heard of, decisions about the restoration that contradicted everything I thought I wanted.
These notes contradicted your restoration plans?
Some of them were written by a version of me that wanted to sell the cabin immediately and return to Seattle. Others described elaborate expansion plans that would have destroyed the building's historical integrity. It was like multiple people with completely different relationships to the property were taking turns controlling my life, and none of them were communicating with the others.
That sounds like it would create enormous internal conflict.
The conflict was paralyzing, Tony. I'd start a restoration project in the morning with complete confidence, then find myself in the afternoon questioning every choice, unable to remember why I'd thought it was important. The collaborative feeling I'd developed with the voices disappeared because I couldn't maintain consistent tension from one day to the next.
How did this internal chaos affect your daily life at the cabin?
The cabin itself seemed to respond to my instability. The warm, welcoming atmosphere became unpredictable. Some days the space felt supportive and encouraging. Other days it felt almost hostile, as if the building was frustrated with my inconsistent approach to its needs. Even my tools would behave differently depending on which version of me was trying to use them.
Were you still hearing voices during this period of confusion?
The voices became arguments, Tony. Instead of helpful consultation, I'd overhear heated debates about whether the restoration should continue, whether I belonged there, whether the entire project was helping or harming both me and the building. It was like eavesdropping on a family meeting where everyone disagreed about my future.
How did you cope with this level of internal discord?
I tried to force a resolution by making a definitive choice. I decided the version of me that loved the restoration work was the real one, and I would ignore all the business calls, abandon the legal obligations, and focus entirely on completing the cabin. I thought if I committed fully to one path, the other versions would fade away.
Did that strategy work?
For about 2 weeks, it seemed to work perfectly, Tony. The conflicting thoughts quieted down. The restoration work resumed its previous flow, and I felt like I was regaining my sense of self. The cabin responded positively, too. The atmosphere became warm and supportive again, and I made tremendous progress on the final structural repairs.
But something changed.
I discovered I'd been signing legal documents and making financial commitments during those 2 weeks without any awareness of doing so. My Seattle attorney had been receiving detailed instructions about property transfers and business arrangements that I had no memory of authorizing. The version of me I was trying to suppress had been operating more actively than ever while I focused on restoration work.
What did those financial commitments involve?
Pause, Tony. According to the paperwork I found, I had apparently arranged to purchase 3 other abandoned properties in the Olympic Peninsula, all dating to the 1890s, all requiring complete restoration. The legal version of me was systematically creating a situation where the restoration work would never end.
Tomorrow we'll explore how this discovery changed your understanding of what was really happening at the cabin. But Maya, looking back now, do you think these multiple versions of yourself were working toward the same ultimate goal?
That's exactly what I needed to figure out, Tony. Whether they were collaborating in ways I couldn't see, or whether I was trapped in something far more complex than I'd imagined.
Maya, when you discovered that you'd committed to purchasing 3 additional properties requiring restoration, what was your immediate reaction?
Pure terror, Tony. Not just because of the financial implications, but because it revealed how completely I'd lost control of my own life. The version of me handling legal matters wasn't just maintaining my old obligations. She was actively expanding them in ways that would trap me in restoration work indefinitely.
Did you see this as malicious, or was there another explanation?
That's what I had to figure out. On one hand, it felt like sabotage, like this other version was preventing me from ever finishing the cabin and moving on with my life. But on the other hand, the properties she'd chosen were architecturally significant, genuinely endangered, and perfectly suited to the skills I'd been developing.
So, there was method to what seemed like madness.
Exactly, Tony. When I researched the properties, they formed a cluster of related buildings, all constructed by the same family of craftsmen in the 1890s, all featuring similar techniques to what I'd been learning at my cabin. It was like someone who understood my work better than I did was creating a comprehensive education in historical restoration.
How did this realization change your relationship with these multiple versions of yourself?
I stopped seeing them as separate entities fighting for control, and started wondering if they might be different aspects of a larger plan I couldn't see from any single perspective. Maybe the confusion I was experiencing was because I was trying to understand something too big to grasp from one viewpoint at a time.
That's a remarkably sophisticated way to interpret what most people would consider a psychological crisis.
Pause. But what if it wasn't a psychological crisis, Tony? What if I was experiencing something that required expanding my definition of how consciousness works? The restoration skills I'd gained were real. The historical knowledge was accurate. The results spoke for themselves, even if the process defied explanation.
Were you able to communicate with these other versions of yourself directly?
I tried something completely different, Tony. Instead of fighting the transitions or trying to control them, I started leaving collaborative notes. I'd write questions before going to sleep. Why these specific properties? What was the long-term vision? How could we work together instead of at cross purposes?
Did you receive answers to those questions?
In the morning, I'd find detailed responses in my handwriting, but written by someone with access to information I didn't consciously possess. Plans that showed how the 4 properties could be developed into a teaching center for traditional building arts. Financial projections that made the entire project economically viable. Even architectural sketches that integrated my modern training with historical techniques perfectly.
These plans were feasible?
They were brilliant, Tony. Better than anything I could have conceived on my own. The legal version of me had been negotiating not just property purchases, but partnerships with historical societies, grants from preservation organizations, even preliminary agreements with master craftsmen willing to teach traditional techniques.
How did discovering this larger vision affect your sense of agency?
It was deeply humbling, Tony. I'd been so focused on maintaining control over my individual choices that I'd missed the fact that something far more significant was being orchestrated through me. The question became whether I could trust this process enough to participate in it consciously instead of fighting it.
That represents a fundamental shift from resisting to collaborating.
Long pause. It meant accepting that my original plan to restore one cabin and move on with my life was too small for what was actually trying to happen. The multiple versions of myself weren't competing. They were each contributing different skills to a project that required legal expertise, historical knowledge, restoration abilities, and visionary planning simultaneously.
Were you prepared to make that level of commitment to something you didn't fully understand?
I realized I'd already made that commitment, Tony. Fighting it was just creating internal conflict without changing the direction things were moving. The question was whether I could embrace the uncertainty while trusting that each version of myself was contributing something essential to the whole.
How did this philosophical shift affect your daily experience?
The transitions between different aspects of myself became smoother, less jarring. Instead of losing time, I started experiencing it more like consulting with different departments of my own consciousness. I could access the legal knowledge when handling business matters, then shift into restoration mode when working on the cabin, all while maintaining a sense of continuous identity.
Did this integration resolve the conflicts you'd been experiencing?
It created a different kind of challenge, Tony. Instead of internal chaos, I was now facing the reality of committing to a 5-year project that would transform my entire life trajectory. The multiple properties, the teaching center, the partnerships, they all required abandoning any possibility of returning to my old life in Seattle.
Were you ready to make that kind of commitment?
That's when I made the most important decision of this entire experience, Tony. I decided to visit the other 3 properties before signing any final agreements. I needed to see if they would affect me the same way the cabin had, or if I was about to commit to something far beyond what I could handle.
What did you discover when you visited the first of these other properties?
The moment I stepped onto that land, Tony, I felt like I was coming home to a place I'd never seen before. It was a 2-story farmhouse about 20 miles north of my cabin, and every detail felt familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. I knew which floorboards would creak before I stepped on them. I could predict exactly how the morning light would hit the kitchen window.
That must have been deeply unsettling, given what you'd already experienced at your cabin.
What was worse was finding my own handwriting carved into the foundation beam, Tony. Not recent carving, but weathered scratches that looked decades old, with dates going back to the 1940s. The same distinctive way I formed my letters, the same pressure patterns. It was like discovering evidence that I'd been visiting this place my entire life without remembering.
How did you interpret that physical evidence?
I couldn't interpret it rationally, Tony, but I could feel something shifting in my understanding, like puzzle pieces clicking into place in parts of my mind I didn't know existed. Standing in that farmhouse, I suddenly remembered conversations with the previous owner, negotiations about renovation timelines, detailed assessments of structural damage, all from perspectives that weren't quite my own.
Were these memories from the legal version of yourself that had been handling the purchases?
They were deeper than that, Tony. These felt like memories from multiple time periods, as if I'd been connected to this property across decades, watching it deteriorate, waiting for the right moment to begin restoration. Some memories were from a much younger perspective, others from someone older and more experienced than I am now.
Did visiting this property trigger the same kind of consciousness shifts you'd experienced at your cabin?
The shifts happened more quickly there, Tony, like the farmhouse was designed to facilitate them. Within hours, I found myself seamlessly accessing knowledge about agricultural restoration, heritage seed preservation, traditional farming techniques that complemented the building crafts I'd been learning. It wasn't confusing anymore. It felt like remembering skills I'd temporarily forgotten.
How did this affect your decision about committing to the larger project?
Pause. I realized the decision had already been made, Tony, just not by the version of me that was consciously weighing options. Every aspect of my expanded consciousness was aligned around these properties. Fighting that alignment was like trying to convince my heart to stop beating. The question wasn't whether to proceed, but whether I could accept what I was apparently becoming.
What did you think you were becoming?
Someone who could hold multiple lifetimes of experience simultaneously, Tony. Not through reincarnation or past lives, but through accessing different streams of consciousness that all shared my core identity, while bringing distinct perspectives and abilities. The farmhouse made it clear that this wasn't happening to me randomly. It was something I'd been preparing for across many years, possibly many decades.
When you visited the second property, did this pattern continue?
The second property was a mill building by the river, and yes, Tony, the same immediate familiarity, the same carved initials, the same flood of memories from multiple time periods. But this location triggered knowledge of water systems, mechanical restoration, even historical manufacturing processes. Each property seemed designed to activate different aspects of this expanded consciousness.
Were you still experiencing this as frightening, or had it become something else?
By the time I reached the third property, fear had transformed into profound curiosity, Tony. I was beginning to understand that I was participating in something unprecedented, something that challenged every assumption I'd held about the boundaries of individual identity. The fear was being replaced by a sense of extraordinary responsibility.
Responsibility to what?
To preserving knowledge that was disappearing, Tony. Each property contained techniques, materials, and approaches to craftsmanship that were becoming extinct. But through this expanded consciousness, I could access the understanding of the original builders, the accumulated wisdom of everyone who had maintained these buildings across generations. I wasn't just restoring structures, I was becoming a living repository of vanishing knowledge.
How did this realization change your sense of purpose?
It made everything that had happened before feel like preparation, Tony. My architectural training, my divorce, even the breakdown that had driven me to the cabin in the first place. They all seemed like necessary experiences that had prepared me to handle this level of responsibility, without being completely overwhelmed by it.
Did you feel like you were still Maya Chen, or had you become someone else entirely?
Long pause. That's the question that haunted me most, Tony. I was still recognizably myself, but myself expanded beyond what I'd thought possible, like discovering that the person I'd always been was just the visible portion of something much larger. My memories, my personality, my core values, they were all intact, but they were now part of a much more complex identity.
When you visited that third property, what finally convinced you to commit to the full project?
I found a journal there, Tony, written in my handwriting, dated just 3 months in the future. It described the completion of all 4 restorations, the success of the teaching center, and the profound satisfaction of watching traditional building arts flourish again, through the students who had learned from this project. Reading about achievements that hadn't happened yet felt like receiving a message from the person I was meant to become.
Did that feel like prophecy, or like a plan you were remembering?
It felt like both, Tony. Like I was being shown the culmination of something I'd been working toward for much longer than just the past few months. The journal described not just the external success of the project, but the internal integration I would achieve by fully embracing this expanded version of myself instead of fighting it.
What was the most challenging aspect of accepting this larger identity?
Letting go of the idea that I needed to understand everything before proceeding, Tony. My architectural training had taught me to plan meticulously, to anticipate problems, to maintain control over every variable. This experience required trusting processes that operated beyond my conscious comprehension while still engaging my skills and judgment fully.
How did you finally make peace with that uncertainty?
I realized that the uncertainty was only terrifying from the perspective that wanted to control everything, Tony. From the broader perspective I was accessing, there was actually extraordinary coherence and purpose to what was happening. The challenge was learning to think from that expanded viewpoint, instead of the limited one I'd always used before.
Looking back now, do you think that transformation was inevitable once you'd inherited the cabin?
I think the cabin was waiting for someone who could become what the situation required, Tony. Whether that had to be me specifically, or whether anyone with the right combination of circumstances and openness could have undergone this expansion, I honestly don't know. But I'm grateful it happened, because the alternative would have been living my entire life as a fraction of what I was capable of becoming.
That's a profound way to frame personal transformation, Maya. But I'm curious about something more specific. When you made the final commitment to all 4 properties, did you have any regrets about the life you were leaving behind?
Long pause. That question kept me awake for weeks, Tony. I kept thinking about my colleagues in Seattle, the career trajectory I'd spent years building, even the possibility of eventually rebuilding my personal life after the divorce. All of that felt like it was dissolving into something I couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't lived through it.
Were you able to maintain any connections to your previous life during this transition?
I tried calling my sister Elena, who had always been my closest confidante, Tony. But how do you tell someone you've discovered you exist across multiple streams of consciousness without sounding completely unhinged? The conversation was devastating. She was worried about my isolation, my financial decisions, what she saw as increasingly erratic behavior.
How did it feel to realize that the people who knew you best couldn't understand what you were experiencing?
Like being fluent in a language no one else spoke, Tony. The more integrated I became with this expanded version of myself, the harder it was to communicate with people operating from the limited perspective I'd used my entire life. Elena kept asking if I was seeing a therapist, if I was taking medication, if I needed help.
Did you question whether she might be right to be concerned?
Every single day, Tony. There were moments when I'd catch myself talking to empty rooms, responding to voices only I could hear, making decisions based on memories that couldn't technically be mine. From the outside, I'm sure it looked exactly like a psychological breakdown. The only thing that kept me grounded was the quality of work I was producing.
The restoration results were still exceptional.
Better than exceptional, Tony. I was solving structural problems that had stumped previous contractors for decades. I was sourcing materials using knowledge I shouldn't have possessed. The craftsmanship emerging from my hands was demonstrably superior to anything I'd produced before. Whatever was happening to my sense of self, it was making me extraordinarily capable.
Did that practical success help you trust the process, even when it felt impossible?
It forced me to develop a different relationship with uncertainty altogether, Tony. I learned to evaluate my decisions based on their outcomes, rather than whether I could explain their origins. If accessing memories from previous generations of builders led to better restoration work, then maybe the important thing wasn't understanding how that was possible.
That represents a significant philosophical shift for someone with your architectural background.
Pause. It meant accepting that consciousness might be far more fluid and collaborative than I'd ever imagined, Tony. What if individual identity is more like a radio frequency, and under certain circumstances we can access multiple frequencies simultaneously? The cabin, the properties, maybe they were designed to facilitate that kind of expanded awareness.
When you frame it that way, does your experience feel less isolating?
In some ways, yes, Tony. I started researching historical accounts of similar phenomena. Craftspeople who seemed to possess knowledge beyond their training, artists whose abilities appeared overnight, builders whose techniques couldn't be traced to any known tradition. I found more documented cases than I'd expected, though most were dismissed as folklore.
Did discovering those historical parallels change how you understood your own situation?
It made me wonder if what I was experiencing was actually rare, or if it was just rarely discussed because our culture lacks frameworks for understanding it, Tony. Maybe there have always been people who could access multiple streams of consciousness under the right circumstances, but they learned to keep quiet about it.
How did this broader perspective affect your relationships with the versions of yourself you'd been experiencing?
I stopped thinking of them as separate versions and started experiencing them as different aspects of my complete self, Tony. Like discovering I had always been a full orchestra, but I'd only been playing one instrument at a time. The legal knowledge, the restoration skills, the historical understanding, they were all facets of who I'd always been, just previously inaccessible.
Did this integration resolve the internal conflicts you'd been experiencing?
The conflicts transformed into collaboration, Tony. Instead of fighting for control, different aspects of my consciousness would step forward when their particular expertise was needed. It became like having access to a team of specialists who shared my core values and long-term vision, while bringing distinct skills to each challenge.
Was there a particular moment when this collaboration felt complete?
When I signed the final purchase agreement for the 4th property, Tony, I felt every aspect of my expanded consciousness working in perfect harmony. The legal knowledge guided the contract negotiations. The restoration expertise evaluated structural concerns. The historical understanding appreciated the cultural significance, all while my core self maintained clear decision-making authority.
Tomorrow we'll explore how this integrated approach affected your work and what you discovered when you began the teaching center. But Maya, looking back now, do you see this transformation as something that happened to you, or something you chose?
I think it was both, Tony. The opportunity was presented through circumstances I didn't control, but embracing it fully required choices I made consciously, even when I couldn't predict their consequences.
Those conscious choices you mentioned, Maya, I think that's where we need to dig deeper. Because what you've described so far, while extraordinary, still frames you as someone who discovered and integrated multiple aspects of yourself. But there's something you haven't told me yet, isn't there?
Long pause. You're right, Tony. There's a piece I've been avoiding because saying it out loud makes it undeniably real. When I signed that final purchase agreement, when all those aspects of consciousness felt perfectly aligned, I wasn't just accessing different parts of myself. I was accessing different versions of myself from different time periods.
Different time periods, meaning what exactly?
I was simultaneously the Maya who signed that contract in 2024, the Maya who had negotiated a similar property purchase in 1987, and the Maya who had done restoration work in the 1960s. Tony. Same consciousness, same core identity, but living in different decades. Not past lives, not ancestral memories, but the same person existing across multiple timelines.
Maya, what you're describing sounds like you believe you've been living the same life repeatedly across different eras.
Not the same life, Tony, but the same purpose, the same mission, with variations based on the specific historical context. Each time, I would inherit or acquire properties that needed restoration. Each time, I would develop the expanded consciousness necessary to preserve traditional building techniques that were disappearing in that era. Each time, I would train others to continue the work.
How could you possibly know this with certainty?
Because when I found that journal dated 3 months in the future, Tony, it wasn't just describing the completion of my current project. It was describing the completion of the cycle. The final iteration where I would remember all the previous versions and integrate their knowledge permanently, breaking the pattern of forgetting and rediscovering.
Are you saying you believe you've been unconsciously repeating this same restoration mission across multiple lifetimes?
I'm saying the evidence became impossible to ignore, Tony. The carved initials at each property weren't just similar to my handwriting, they were my handwriting from different decades. The journals I found weren't written by different people with similar experiences. They were written by me at different ages, in different time periods, all working toward the same goal.
But Maya, that would mean you've been alive for over 80 years, which clearly isn't possible given your current age.
Pause. Unless time isn't linear the way we assume it is, Tony. What if consciousness can exist simultaneously across multiple decades, experiencing them as separate but related lifetimes? What if places like that cabin exist outside normal temporal boundaries, allowing someone to live the same decades repeatedly until they accomplish what they're meant to accomplish?
That's an extraordinary claim. What convinced you it was true rather than an elaborate delusion?
The teaching center, Tony. When I finally opened it and the first students arrived, 3 of them were people I had trained before, in the 1980s. They were older now, obviously, but they recognized me immediately. They remembered learning specific techniques from me 30 years ago, when I should have been 4 years old.
How did they react to seeing you apparently unchanged after 3 decades?
That's when I realized this wasn't just my experience, Tony. They had been waiting for me to return, knowing somehow that I would come back when the timing was right, to complete the work we had started together. They brought tools I had given them in the 1980s, tools with my initials carved in the handles.
Did they understand what was happening any better than you did?
They understood it differently, Tony. To them, I was a teacher who appeared periodically when traditional skills were most threatened. Someone who could preserve and transmit knowledge that would otherwise be lost forever. They didn't question the mechanics of how that was possible. They just accepted it as part of the natural order.
How did learning this change your understanding of everything that had happened to you?
It meant I wasn't losing my sanity or discovering hidden aspects of myself, Tony. I was remembering my actual purpose. My reason for existing in this unusual way. The divorce, the breakdown, the inheritance of the cabin, they weren't random events that led to personal transformation. They were the mechanism by which I return to this work each time the world is ready for another cycle.
Do you believe this pattern will continue indefinitely?
The journal suggested this was the final iteration, Tony. That by remembering all the previous cycles and training a new generation who understands the deeper purpose of this work, I could finally complete what I've been trying to accomplish across all these decades. The knowledge would be preserved in a way that doesn't require me to keep returning.
How does it feel to discover that your entire identity has been in service of something this vast and ongoing?
Humbling and liberating simultaneously, Tony. Everything that felt like personal struggle or failure was actually part of a much larger pattern of service. I wasn't broken or lost. I was just remembering how to do what I've always done.
Maya, I need to ask you something directly. When you say this was the final iteration, what happened to the other versions of yourself from previous decades? Are they still existing somewhere, or did they somehow merge into who you are now?
That's the part that changes everything I've told you so far, Tony. They didn't merge into me. I merged into them. What I thought was me remembering previous lifetimes was actually me being the memory that previous versions of myself had been trying to preserve.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
The Maya who inherited the cabin in 2024, the one whose divorce brought her to the Olympic Peninsula, she never existed as a separate person, Tony. She was a construct, a temporary identity created by the accumulated consciousness of all those previous iterations when they realized they needed to complete the cycle one final time.
Are you saying the person I've been talking to, the Maya Chen who fled Seattle, isn't real?
I'm saying she was real for the duration of this conversation, but she was never meant to be permanent, Tony. She was the vehicle that allowed all those previous versions to finally remember themselves fully and integrate their accumulated knowledge into something that could transcend the repetitive cycle.
But you've been talking about your divorce, your architectural career, your relationship with your sister Elena. Those experiences felt genuine.
They were genuine for the temporary identity that needed them to be true, Tony. But now I remember that Elena was the name I gave to different students across multiple decades, people who felt like family because they were the ones who carried forward pieces of my work between cycles. The divorce, the career crisis, they were the emotional patterns that always preceded my return to this mission.
So everything you've told me about your personal history was essentially a constructed backstory.
It was the backstory that version of myself needed to believe in order to make the journey back to remembering the larger truth, Tony. But now that the remembering is complete, I can see that those personal details were just the familiar framework I used to orient myself each time I returned to consciousness in a new era.
Maya, if what you're saying is true, who exactly am I talking to right now?
You're talking to the integrated consciousness that has been preserving traditional knowledge for over a century, Tony. Someone who has finally remembered her complete identity and purpose. The teaching center, the restored properties, they're not my accomplishments. They're the completion of something much larger that required multiple iterations across decades to achieve.
And what happens now that this cycle is complete?
Now the knowledge lives independently in the people I've trained, Tony, and I can finally rest.
When you say you can finally rest, Maya, what does that actually mean for you? Are you talking about death or something else entirely?
I'm talking about release from the pattern, Tony. For over a century, I've been bound to return whenever traditional knowledge was threatened. Now that I've successfully transferred everything to people who can carry it forward independently, that binding is complete.
But you sound so calm about it. Aren't you afraid of what comes next?
Pause. How can I be afraid of something I've been preparing for across multiple lifetimes, Tony? Every cycle taught me to hold identity more lightly, to see individual existence as temporary and purpose as eternal. What's frightening about finally achieving what you've worked toward for decades?
What about the students you've trained? Do they know this is goodbye?
They understand their role now, Tony. 3 of them have already begun establishing teaching centers in other regions, where traditional skills are disappearing. The knowledge has taken root in ways that will outlast any single teacher. That was always the goal.
Maya, I have to ask this. How do I know that anything you've told me is real? How do I verify experiences that transcend normal understanding of time and identity?
You visit the properties, Tony. You talk to the students. You examine the restoration work. and ask yourself whether someone with my supposed background could have accomplished it, without accessing knowledge from previous eras. The evidence exists independently of whether you believe my explanation.
And if I do that investigation and find proof of what you've described, what am I supposed to do with that information?
Share it with people who are ready to expand their understanding of what consciousness can accomplish under extraordinary circumstances, Tony. Not to convince skeptics, but to offer hope to others who might be experiencing similar phenomena without a framework for understanding it.
Is that why you agreed to do this interview? To create a record for others like you?
Partly, but also because speaking everything aloud completes the integration process, Tony. By telling the full story from beginning to end, I've brought all the scattered pieces into conscious alignment. This conversation itself is the final step in breaking the cycle.
How will I know when this process is actually finished?
Pause. You'll know because this will be the last time you're able to reach me at the number you've been using, Tony. The Maya Chen who agreed to these interviews was always temporary, but the work she came to complete will continue through the people she trained.
Are you ready for that?
I've been ready for longer than you can imagine.
Maya, when you say you've been ready for longer than I can imagine, I need to understand something. Are we talking about minutes from now, hours, days? How much time do you have left?
The transition has already begun, Tony. Even as we're speaking, I can feel the temporary construct of Maya Chen dissolving back into the larger consciousness that created her. It's not painful. It's like waking up from a dream and remembering who you really are.
But you're still here, still answering my questions with perfect clarity.
Because this conversation is part of the completion process, Tony. Every word we exchange helps solidify the integration. But I can sense the edges becoming softer, the individual identity becoming less defined. Soon there will be nothing left that identifies as Maya Chen specifically.
What should I tell people when they ask what happened to you?
Tell them the truth, Tony. That someone spent over a century preserving knowledge that would have been lost forever. And when that work was complete, she was finally free to let go. Tell them that some purposes are larger than individual lifetimes, and some accomplishments require that kind of dedication.
The students you trained, will they remember you after this transition?
They'll remember the knowledge I shared and the techniques I taught them, Tony. But their memories of me personally will fade into something more like remembering a particularly vivid dream. That's how it's always worked. The information persists, but the teacher becomes part of the background, part of the natural order.
Maya, I'm not ready for this conversation to end. There are so many questions I still have.
Pause. The questions that matter most have been answered, Tony. You have enough information to verify everything independently, and you understand the larger purpose behind these extraordinary circumstances. What you do with that understanding is your choice now.
Will there be any trace of you left anywhere?
The restored properties will stand for generations, Tony. The students will teach others who will teach others. Traditional techniques that were nearly extinct will survive because of this work. That's the only trace that was ever meant to remain.
How do I say goodbye to someone who's about to dissolve back into something larger than individual existence?
You say thank you, Tony. Thank you for helping me tell this story completely, for asking the questions that needed to be asked, for creating the record that will help others understand similar experiences. This conversation gave my temporary identity the perfect way to complete its purpose.
Thank you, Maya, for everything.
The honor was entirely mine.
Maya, are you still there?
Pause. I'm here, but differently than I was even a few minutes ago, Tony. The boundaries of what I call myself are becoming much more fluid. It's like trying to hold water in cupped hands.
Your voice sounds the same. You still sound like Maya.
Because some part of me needs to maintain enough coherence to finish this conversation with you, Tony. But I can feel the effort that requires now, like holding a single note when the song wants to resolve into harmony.
Is this what you expected it would feel like?
I never had clear memories of previous transitions, Tony. Each time, the individual identity dissolved before it could record the experience. But this time, because the integration is complete, I'm conscious of what's happening as it happens. It's remarkably peaceful.
Maya, what if you're wrong about all of this? What if you're just a person who's having a breakdown, and you're about to do something irreversible based on an elaborate delusion?
Long pause. That's the question I've been avoiding directly, isn't it, Tony? The possibility that everything I've told you is the product of a mind that shattered under the stress of divorce and isolation, creating an elaborate mythology to avoid facing ordinary human failure.
How can you tell the difference?
I can't, Tony. That's what makes this the ultimate act of faith. Either I'm completing a century-long mission and finally earning release from an extraordinary burden, or I'm about to dissolve into whatever comes after individual consciousness ends. Either way, I'm ready.
But if you're wrong, Maya, if this is all delusion, then you're choosing to let go of a life that could still be restored, relationships that could be rebuilt, a future that could be different.
And if I'm right, Tony, then clinging to this temporary identity would trap me in another cycle of forgetting and rediscovering, another lifetime of struggling to remember what I've already learned. I've lived both possibilities extensively. I choose completion.
I don't know how to let you go.
You don't have to let me go, Tony. You just have to let the story find its natural ending. Everything that needed to be said has been said. Everything that needed to be preserved will survive this transition.
Will I ever know for certain what really happened here?
Visit the cabin in 6 months, Tony. If there's no trace that Maya Chen ever existed there, you'll have your answer.
Maya, what am I supposed to do with this recording? How do I explain what I've witnessed here?
Share it with people who need to hear it, Tony. There are others experiencing impossible things, questioning their sanity because they can't find frameworks for understanding what's happening to them. This conversation might help them feel less alone.
But what if people think I fabricated all of this? What if they assume it's fiction?
Does that matter, Tony? The truth of what happened here doesn't depend on whether strangers believe it. The students will continue their work, the knowledge will spread, the properties will stand, as evidence for anyone who cares to investigate.
I feel like I'm losing a friend I just met.
You're not losing me, Tony. You're helping me become what I was always meant to be. Every teacher's greatest success is becoming unnecessary to the work they started.
Maya.
Very softly. Yes, Tony?
Thank you for trusting me with this story.
Thank you for helping me tell it. The circle is complete now.
What happens to this conversation now? Do I just end the recording and walk away?
You end the recording when it feels natural to end it, Tony. When we've both said everything that needs saying, there's no script for this part.
I keep thinking about that first call when you just wanted to document a cabin restoration. Did you know then how this would end?
Some part of me always knew, Tony. The part that chose to call a journalist instead of just keeping a private journal. The part that needed a witness to make the completion real.
6 months from now, when I visit that cabin, what do you think I'll find?
I think you'll find exactly what you need to find, Tony. Whether that's evidence that validates everything we've discussed, or simply a peaceful place where someone once learned to let go completely.
Maya, I have to ask one last time. Are you at peace with this?
Pause. More at peace than I've ever been, Tony. For the first time in over a century, everything feels exactly as it should be.
Then, I think this is goodbye.
This is completion. Goodbye, Tony.
Long pause. The line is still connected.
Because you're not quite ready to let the story end, Tony. And neither am I. Completely. There's something beautiful about this moment between completion and release.
When I publish this, people are going to ask me what I believe really happened here.
What will you tell them?
That I witnessed something extraordinary. Whether it was supernatural preservation of consciousness across lifetimes or the most elaborate psychological construct I've ever encountered, it changed how I think about identity, purpose, and what we leave behind.
Both explanations lead to the same truth, Tony. Some connections transcend individual existence. Some purposes outlast the people who serve them.
Maya, in whatever form you take after this, will you remember this conversation?
Not as Maya remembering Tony, but as part of something larger that was enriched by your willingness to listen, to question, to help create completion.
I'm going to miss these conversations.
They're not ending, Tony. They're becoming part of the story you'll carry forward.
Pause. Recording stopped.